A popular saying is that art imitates life, and in turn, life imitates art. The true extent of this can be terrifying, no more so than the nature of war cinema. Since ancient times, man has been fascinated by war, but only recently have we discovered its inherent trauma and explored it through the medium of cinema. Naturally, entire films have been made with this newfound trauma as a dramatic tool, if not their entire premise. It all kicked off at the Vietnam War, and still affects all of us. War cinema began almost as soon as cinema itself, but it only really came to prominence with the advancements of the 1920s and 30s, with such films owing more to technological progress than the depths of their stories and meaning. But then the Second World War came and demonstrated just how brutal modern war could be. This carnage gave the film industry a new role, to cheer people up, to relieve them with action and adventure as a direct escape from the war-torn world around them. Even when the film is set there, especially when America's greatest war hero, Audie Murphy, reenacts his heroics on the big screen into Hell and Back, based on his memoir of the same name. At its peak, the war film was an experience of emotion and spectacle, the audience framed squarely as witnesses to an important event, cheering on the Allies and booing the Axis. An iconic example is the 1969 film The Battle of Britain. The uniforms, weapons, and some locations are accurate, the characters archetypical, the sets authentic, and the action flashy and spectacular with a hint of tension, but ultimately feeling very detached and surface level in its respectable, unintrusive spectacle. In this scene, German Stuka dive bombers attack a radar station on England's south coast. Note the camera angles and the way the bomb explosions are viewed.
Stuka.
The rest of the scene plays without music, but most of the dogfight sequences in the film are underscored with this. By contrast, look at how Christopher Nolan's 2017 film, Dunkirk, treats those same elements. The difference is night and day. The audience is thrown straight into the character's situation. Instead of stock archetypes, they represent the anxiety of the audience. The historical location of Dunkirk is accurate, though no longer authentic. Despite this, its current appearance encapsulates what Nolan sought to capture with this film: isolation and sheer dread. The planes and falling bombs are no longer exciting environmental elements, they are threats, whose inevitable return only builds further tension. So, what changed war films from this to this? The subgenre of anti-war was not unheard of before the Vietnam War, but it is from that war where it will become seriously popular. It was the first war where a major combatant's defeat was constantly broadcast live around the world, and more of its veterans were reporting symptoms of vivid, powerful, and very visual trauma. This went beyond mere combat stress. It was far more soul-consuming and needed a new definition. In 1987, the American Psychiatric Association published 4 pages that changed the way in which trauma was viewed, naming the condition post-traumatic stress disorder.
PTSD came to the fore in the aftermath of the Vietnam War as a formal psychiatric diagnosis by the American Psychiatric Association.
This is Edgar Jones, Professor of the History of Medicine and Psychiatry at King's College London, an expert on the psychiatry of war.
The Vietnam War ends in 1975, so a large number of the people coming forward for treatment are in fact Vietnam veterans, and they're treated by the Veterans Administration. So a lot of the clinical data that's coming through is of US servicemen who've been through traumatic experiences in Vietnam, and psychiatrists are trying to find ways to treat them and understand what's wrong with them.
As defined by that publication, PTSD is the development of characteristic symptoms following a psychologically distressing event that is outside the range of unusual human experience, wherein the characteristic symptoms involve re-experiencing the traumatic event, avoidance of stimuli associated with the event, or numbing of general responsiveness and increased arousal. The APA then legitimizes the flashback as a diagnosable symptom, describing it as recurrent and intrusive recollections of the event, or recurrent distressing dreams during which the event is re-experienced.
But this is also a time when Hollywood is very interested in movies of the Vietnam War, The Deer Hunter, for example, Apocalypse Now. And so it's a key time, really, when you've got a meeting between a new diagnosis affecting a significant number of Americans at a time when Hollywood is particularly interested in the Vietnam War, which is having a lasting and significant effect on veterans throughout the United States.
Three key examples of post-Vietnam War films that use PTSD as a storytelling tool are the American-European film Cross of Iron, the Russian film Come and See, and especially the American film Jacob's Ladder. Cross of Iron is the most conventional of these examples, but uses clever cinematic techniques to immerse the audience into the post-traumatic disorder of its main protagonist, Sergeant Steiner, and even join him in his journey into madness and darkness.
I think Cross of Iron it gives a powerful, immersive experience, a bit like directors have been doing with films like Dunkirk. It puts you in the place of the soldier, in the front line, and gives you a sense of the intensity of the experience, the noise, the chaos, and the enormous psychological stress that these soldiers are under.
He is depicted as a war-weary yet still noble soldier in the first act of the film, right up until the instant he witnesses an unnecessary death at the start of an enemy attack. A montage of deliberately disorienting images act as the transition to him waking up in hospital.
Peckinpah's probably plugged into something, which would happen. If a soldier's pulled out of combat, he's probably sleep deprived and will likely be drifting in and out of consciousness.
We then see Steiner in a military hospital as a party is being held, and then cut to one of his comrades nearby.
In that mental state, you have what's known as hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. So one is as you fall asleep and one is as you awake. And we came across very similar accounts in First World War soldiers who would be lying in a hospital bed and would see the face of a German soldier coming towards them. So I think that's quite an accurate observation of a serviceman who's been wounded but who's been through a period of extended combat and is suffering psychologically.
This signals the start of Steiner's degrading ability to tell reality from delusion. This is slowly escalated through the rest of the film, eventually leading to Steiner's complete loss of morals, sanity, and a developed indifference to the hell he finds himself in. Less conventional and more cerebral is the trauma laced throughout Come and See. The film is entirely from the perspective of Fliora, a young boy who joins a partisan force fighting against the brutal German occupation of Belorussia. However, the horror, wanton cruelty, and atrocities present from both sides of the conflict wear him down and visibly age and deteriorate him, turning him into a shell of a human being and filling his childhood with naught but trauma.
Well, the director and his scriptwriter put a lot of effort into making this as realistic as possible because they filmed it in the area where the fighting took place. They used original equipment, they used live ammunition at some point, and they put the the 15-year-old, 16-year-old who plays the principal part through enormous hardship, wading through a swamp, keeping him awake. He loses a significant amount of weight throughout the filming. When you look at his face, you think he really is terrified. I find at times it's difficult to know when the acting stops and the real fear begins.
This type of method filmmaking, long takes and a lack of important dialogue emphasises the image of the boy and the subject he witnesses, as well as the grating, high-pitched sounds that ring throughout the film as a clear emulation of the experience of Fliora's constant trauma.
The director, he was in St. Petersburg, and the scriptwriter was with the partisans. So I think they felt that the message was so important that they had to go close to realism as they could possibly get in order to demonstrate to people, the audience, just how awful war is and the longer-term effects it's going to have on your mental health.
Director L.M. Klimov was eager to describe the horrors that he lived through in St. Petersburg, known at the time as Stalingrad, site of the bloodiest battle in history.
Дело в том, что я родом из Сталинграда. Мальчиком, естественно, я был и видел и вот эти бомбежки, и вот этот весь город горел, весь, до неба. Горела река. И плюс еще и нас бомбили. То есть она кипела еще и от бомб. Это река, значит, на нас ложились, значит, мамы наши, накрывали нас какими-то там одеялами, подушками, а сверху еще на нас ложились, естественно. Вот поэтому дело в том, что у меня остались очень сильные детские впечатления.
Perhaps the reason why Come and See is often referred to as one of the scariest films of all time is Klimov emulating his own trauma as accurately as possible and set to unleashing it on the audience with terrifying effect. Then there are the films that settled not for weaving the effect of PTSD through the narrative and cinematography, but using the disorder itself as a story mechanic and lens to view the characters and world with. Jacob's Ladder is one such film, where Army veteran Jacob Singer finds himself haunted by nightmares of a battle he fought in the Vietnam War, and of waking visions where monsters or tormented surgeries come to get him. However, he finds that his old comrades suffer identical visions and feelings of being hunted, which unravels a terrifying conspiracy and makes him question if the visions are actually real. The film's twist arguably undermines it as a film about PTSD, but the parallels between the rise in diagnosis of the disorder and the nature of the trauma in the film is unmistakable. It rests on the tension, almost every frame hiding a potential monster or disturbing flashback, a tension constantly felt by sufferers of the disorder. In one scene, Jacob is making his way through a crowded dance party when he sees a couple heavily making out. This scene lines up with a crass interpretation of a key symptom of PTSD, heightened arousal, which explicitly means hypervigilance and intensification of emotions, potentially including a disturbed view on sex and romance. The cult success of Jacob's Ladder and other such films focusing on the trauma of Vietnam War veterans made Jacob Singer and other characters like him the embodiments of post-traumatic stress. But why was this the point in which the disorder became a cultural touchstone? Cross of Iron and Come and See, though released after the end of the Vietnam War, focused on the trauma of a more brutal war that ended decades before the latter even began. And to top it off, Audie Murphy, war hero and star of the action film based on his battles, described in his memoir that his war efforts and heroics only gave him nightmares, trauma and regret, which he was known to grapple with for the rest of his life. And he was far from alone. Why then was there not a huge anti-war revival in the aftermath of World War II? Why was there no culture of trauma acceptance, with PTSD only just embraced as a film concept in the wake of Vietnam? What it ultimately comes down to is a question of when the history influenced cinema. But what if I told you it was likely the other way round? In 2003, a study by the British journal Psychiatry, Professor Jones amongst its contributors, sought to investigate just why much of the symptoms of PTSD, foremost among them the flashback, were only just identified in the mid-20th century if the consensus was that the condition always existed and was merely unreported.
We had permission to look at war pension records in the UK, and so we studied servicemen who had a war pension for a psychological wound after the First World War, after the Second World War, and more recently after the Gulf War and conflicts in Bosnia and the Balkans. Through the war pension records, we could follow up their symptoms over 20 years and compare how these patterns of symptoms changed over time. Because our Gulf War population, our Bosnia population, had a diagnosis of PTSD. So we were able to look at the way typical presentations in different wars were slightly different. We were lucky that we had this window of opportunity and funding to look at large numbers, random samples of veterans over a significant period of time, and that enabled us to look for flashbacks in each of these three populations. We found them amongst the First World War veterans and the Second World War veterans, but there were fewer of them than you found amongst veterans of much more recent conflicts.
So what was the link? The study's answer? The rise of film.
So we were just trying to think of cultural reasons why people would be more familiar and receptive to this dramatic device. People went to the cinema in the First World War and they had documentary films. Large numbers of people went, but they didn't include flashbacks.
The industry only became commercially viable from the First World War onward, and more cinematic techniques were explored the more advanced film technology and editing became, and the higher budgets increased. Among these techniques was the flashback.
One idea was that the flashback has become a particularly effective cinematic device, that the Vietnam War movies, a lot of them do use the dramatic cut where the veteran is at home and then immediately is transported to a terrifying event in the past. That is a feature of the modern cinema. You see flashbacks in movies made in the Second World War, but they're much more subtle. They're not designed to make the person jump. They don't have the same dramatic quality. And we were hypothesizing that there was something in modern culture that made the flashback more familiar.
This rested on the theory of montage, the ability of the audience to recognize two different images as being linked due to their mere presence in a sequence. Jones and his colleagues argue that as film became more popular, our memories became more cinematic, and therefore influenced how our trauma is experienced after the fact.
Cinema is enormously powerful at reaching large audiences and creating a whole series of emotional experiences in a short period of time, where the audience is given the sense of being there on the battlefield alongside the soldier. These films are becoming increasingly powerful and drawing a new audience in. I suspect that movies will continue to be probably the preeminent narrative of warfare and conflict.
Do filmmakers have the right to dictate what we feel? To what point does history, war, and film blend with each other? And in light of this, is there really such a difference between myth and potential reality? That, perhaps, is the ultimate trauma.